Hi everyone, my name is Ames and welcome to my Lit Day presentation. Today I'm going to be talking about my capstone project tentatively titled I Need to Tell My Story Properly, Narrative and Comedic Form in Netflix Comedy Specials. In my thesis, I look specifically at two specials, Nanette and Homecoming King, and my theoretical grounding for the piece comes from a book called Forms by Carolyn Levine. In the book, Levine defines forms as an arrangement of elements, an ordering, patterning, or shaping. This definition includes literary forms like the novel, social forms like capitalism, and physical forms like the DC metro system. Levine argues that all forms have affordances, latent potentialities that can be activated within any particular iteration. Although comedy and humor studies is an established field, because the form of the Netflix comedy special is so new, only about 10 years old, the existing body of scholarly literature on Netflix specials is quite small. And as Netflix studies has lately been coming into its own as a scholarly field, there has not been a ton of research on the platform's propensity towards stand-up specifically. Most articles at this point are more concerned with just one special in particular and not a more macro analysis of the form itself, which is what I attempt to do in my thesis. This slide is my tentative thesis statement. I'll go ahead and let y'all pause if you want to read it over. But let's dig into things. So in my analysis of Nanette, I read the two repeating phrases, I have to quit comedy, and I need to tell my story properly as rhythms, which structure Gadsby's argument about the value of stand-up comedy. In the piece, she establishes a dichotomy between jokes and stories. Jokes, she says, have two parts, a setup and a punchline. Meanwhile, stories have a full three parts, a beginning, a middle, and an end. As we'll see in this first clip that I'm about to show you, Gatsby also sets these rhythms up along with the idea of illness versus well-being, where stories are presented as a healthier alternative to jokes, especially for comedians of marginalized identities. So in my original video, this is where I played a quick 1-minute clip of Nanette, but unfortunately my first video was flagged by YouTube for copyright violations of Netflix and of Nanette specifically. So I've included the paragraph of what was said by Gadsby in that quick clip, so please feel free to pause now and go ahead and read through that. If Netflix okays my copyright claim, in the next few days I'll put that original video back up. So now that y'all have seen a little bit of the show, at the very end of Nanette, Gatsby continues with the sickness versus health motif to assert that laughter is not our medicine, stories hold our cure. Although this is the explicit argument of Nanette, Gatsby's formal choice of a comedy show as the platform for making this argument urges us to look a little bit deeper. As such, I argue that Nanette is better understood not as a collection of jokes, but as a bounded whole, which actually tells a complete story in and of itself. This clip that I just showed y'all actually outlines the narrative arc of the show. The first part is the beginning of Gatsby's career, where she made fun of herself and her identity to get laughs. In the middle, she takes a step back and begins to reassess. And in the end, Gatsby quits comedy, or at least a particular kind of comedy where she is the butt of every joke. In this sense, the creation of Nanette is the end of the narrative arc of Nanette, as well as a new model for a stand-up comedy that can tell a story as well as just jokes. So on to Homecoming King. So in my analysis, I look specifically at how Minhaj mobilizes the form of network to argue that the American dream is the ability to make choices on one's own terms, regardless of what other people think, even in the context of individual bigotry and systemic racism. Minhaj builds his special around interpersonal networks, technological networks like social media and the internet, and global and domestic transportation networks. Also through direct addresses to both live audience members and through the camera, he also creates a network between himself, the live audience members, and the Netflix viewer. This next clip that I'm going to show you all took place in a conversation between Minhaj and his father after his family was threatened and their car was vandalized in the wake of 9/11.
It's like living in North Korea, and I'll say something. He looks at me and he goes, Hassan, ye cheezein to hote hain, aur ye cheezein hoenge. These things happen, and these things will continue to happen. That's the price we pay for being. And that's when I was like, oh no, we really are from two different generations. Like BMX bikes aside, And my dad's from that generation, like a lot of immigrants, where he feels like if you come to this country, you pay this thing like the American dream tax, right? Like you're going to endure some racism. And if it doesn't cost you your life, well, hey, you lucked out, pay it. There you go, Uncle Sam. But for me, like a lot of us, I was born here. So I actually have the audacity of equality.
What we see here is an example of how Minhaj draws audience members into the narrative. So when contrasting his own view with his father's, he says, "But for me, like a lot of us, I was born here," and gestures specifically at several brown audience members at the front of the stage before going on to give his opinion. These kinds of references continue throughout the show, made to audience members of various identities and positionalities. While in the net, the Netflix viewer is positioned as a passive bystander, watching this back and forth between audience and performer. Minhaj's direct addresses to the camera refuse to let the Netflix audience go by unnoticed, and he actually draws specific attention to the positionality of the Netflix viewer at home, as well as those live in the audience. This is why I ultimately argue that although Nanette is a great comedy special, it's not necessarily a great Netflix special in the same way that Homecoming King is, because it doesn't actually mobilize the unique affordances offered by being a show filmed with more viewers sitting at home on their couches than live in the theater. And as this form continues to popularize and expand, I predict that we will see even more comedians continue to break down the form and utilize it to its fullest potential. For marginalized comedians especially, the Netflix special is an untapped form that can not only entertain, but can also question, critique, and make an argument for how comedy and the world at large should be. Thank you.